All right, welcome to another Objectivist Q&A. So I want to start out with a quick reminder that this week I am fundraising for a new home recording studio. So if you want to increase the audio and certainly the visual quality of everything I'm doing, go to donswriting.com/studio. And thanks to everybody so far who has donated. I think we're going to get some really amazing equipment, a really great setup, and with a little skill building on my part, we should have some even more awesome videos and audio coming to you in a few weeks. So one other reminder, which is that if you have a question, send it to don@donswriting.com, or if you go into the notes for this video, you'll be able to find a link to my webpage where you can submit them. Still have a pretty good queue, but you guys have been doing an amazing job sending in great questions, so I'd love to get some more. All right, first question is from Theodore. What is the objectivist position on abortion? And the simplest way to think about it is that the objectivist position is that rights apply to individuals, and until you're born, you're not an individual. You are a potential individual human being, but you're not an actual human being with rights. Potentials can't have rights. It's important to keep in mind what rights are, right? They are moral principles for structuring and governing a society, and in effect, what they do is they say, here's your sphere of freedom. This is the sphere in which you can take independent action, and if you disagree with somebody, you can go your separate ways. And none of that applies to the unborn. They're literally physically attached inside, dependent on the mother in a biological sense. They are literally a part, and so it's completely irrelevant in that context, that they have the potential to not be a part. They have the potential to be an organism that can interact with the world and be interacted with separately from the mother. They, at that moment in time, are not. And so the only rights that are relevant are the rights of the mother. One really interesting thing about this issue is how clear-cut Ayn Rand thought it was. Because most of us think of this is a hard or this is a tricky issue. And so the fact that she thought it was clear-cut doesn't make it clear-cut, but it's useful to ask why she thought this was a straightforward issue. And it's because she insisted that the essential issue is the first trimester. And here she thought it was perceptually obvious that you don't yet have a formed human being, and that therefore what the woman was asked to sacrifice for this unborn, unformed organism was so enormous, the scale of what's required to carry it to term and to take responsibility for it once it's born, that anyone demanding that kind of sacrifice was monstrous. And so it's no accident that the vast majority of opponents of abortion are religious, because there is no other possible basis for calling an embryo a human being than faith. And the idea that and faith that what it means to be a human being is to have some mystical soul rather than to be a living organism. And so I think Ayn Rand regarded it as really twisted that anti-abortionists called their view pro-life, because they're against the only actual human life involved, the mother's. And somebody pointed this out once, and I'm sorry I can't give credit, but they noted that this and the religious attitude towards assisted suicide, it's like the only lives that they care about are the ones that don't yet exist and the ones that are already dead in the human sense. Human life is sacred, but a truly human life is not the biological functions of an entity with human DNA. It is the life of a thinking being able to pursue values. And let me, by the way, address one of the worst arguments against abortion, which I've heard Ben Shapiro make, and it's essentially, look, how are you going to draw a line between a baby that's just been born and say it has rights and the same baby a few minutes before? And okay, if you agree that killing a newborn is evil, which I certainly do, then obviously we can extend that back a few minutes. It was just a few minutes ago. It's basically the same thing, right? And so by the same reasoning, we can keep saying, well, what was the difference between that baby a few minutes ago and a few minutes before that and a few minutes before that? And so if we want to draw a bright line that keeps us from killing newborns, we basically have to say that, not basically, we have to say that life starts at conception. That's the only bright line that can protect newborns. Okay. This is a bad argument. In fact, this is so bad an argument that it actually has a name, the line drawing fallacy. And the idea is that, and here I have a quote from criticalthinkingacademy.net. Either there is a precise line to be drawn or there is no line to be drawn, no difference between one end of the line and the other. And they give a really cute illustration that reveals what's wrong with it. John is not rich. If someone gives him $1, he is not going to become rich. If he is given $2, he is not going to become rich. So how many ever dollars is he given? So how many ever dollars he's given, he is never going to become rich. What if we were to give him $20 million one by one very quickly? Of course he would become rich. But since we cannot point to the precise dollar which makes him rich, he can never get rich. So the fallacy. This is a little convoluted the way they wrote it, but you get the point, right? It's that since you can always say that the difference between $1 and one more dollar is so small as to not make a meaningful difference, then no number of dollars can ever transform somebody from poor into rich. But if you think about, and so this is, why this idea of, well, the baby 4 minutes ago versus the baby 4 minutes later is wrong, but it's even more outright stupid in the context of abortion, because what brighter line could you ever draw between the difference between being born and unborn? As one of my friends quipped, yeah, we might even make it into a holiday. One last issue is crucially important. This is going to come up with a later question, which is that just because something is and should be legal doesn't necessarily imply that it's moral. You can definitely have an abortion for immoral reasons. But on the other hand, and this is a point objectivists have stressed, but I want to highlight the other side of that equation, which is just because giving birth is legal doesn't mean it's always moral. I believe that for many people, having a child is immoral because they are in no position to be parents, because having the child would be a total sacrifice for them, and yet they do it anyway out of conformity, guilt, the desire for unearned love, or some other bad motive. And so it is important to keep in mind this distinction between the moral and the legal, and to recognize that, yes, sometimes abortion can be immoral, sometimes giving birth can be immoral, but the fundamental question is, when do rights enter the picture? Because that has to be the deciding factor, and there's no rational way you can ascribe rights, certainly to something that is not yet even in any significant sense a differentiated organism, and then ultimately not until it's an biologically independent organism in the world that can interact with other people as individuals. Here's a question from Jacob. Why is man's life the standard of value rather than one's own life? This would make it both the standard and the purpose, ? After all, I shouldn't use the man's life concept to choose which food is healthy if I'm allergic to that particular food. That seems to be a clear example where one's own life is the standard of value, not man's life. So, let's see. Let me start out just by summarizing the objectivist position, and then I'll come back to the question. So the ultimate value, your life, names your proper moral goal, but a goal is not yet a guide. Like, by itself, embracing our life as the ultimate value, it doesn't give us sufficient guidance to identify the more specific values and virtues that will sustain us. And that's why we need a standard, which in objectivism we put as man's life, or man's life qua man, or man's survival qua man. There's different ways of putting it, but the way that Ayn Rand would summarize it is something like the terms, methods, conditions, and goals required for the survival of a rational entity through the whole of its lifespan. And then I think she has a tagline like, in every aspect open to his choice. And so this is different than the purpose of morality. It's the standard because it's giving us a measurement, a way of choosing our specific concrete purposes and actions. And so why is that so important? Well, man's life is specifying that which is contained in her conception of the ultimate value. It's looking at your life from a certain perspective, which is as a being that survives by reason. And by making our means of survival explicit, by putting that in as the standard, it gives us a lead as to the kinds of goals and actions that are going to sustain us and allow us to come up with a whole constellation of self-sustaining goals and actions that will constitute a human life. And her famous summary statement of this is, since reason is man's basic means of survival, that which is proper to the life of a rational being is good, and that which opposes it or negates it or destroys it is evil. And the key thing that should jump out to you is that the vast majority of how you should act isn't determined by things unique to you, but by things common to human beings, given that we survive by reason. And so all of the philosophic values and virtues, what we're mainly, the things that we're concerned about when we're trying to formulate a moral code, these are going to be focused on reason. They're going to be focused on establishing the right relationship between a volitional consciousness and existence. But it's not going to tell you everything about how to live. A lot of that is going to mean using your reason to achieve specific knowledge. And some of that will be universal to human beings, and some of it will be individual. So, morality is not going to tell you what to eat, but, if you remember Ayn Rand's aside in Philosophy Who Needs It, she said it will give you the means to find out. That said, even nutrition, which is not a philosophic value, obviously, it's not the kind of thing you're isolating when you're trying to identify philosophic values and virtues. Even with nutrition, the starting point is thinking about human life in general. So the fact that we need food, the fact that we need so many calories, the fact that we have the ability to eat both animals and plants, the fact that food can be contaminated, like a whole lot of our knowledge about nutrition, that knowledge comes from our general knowledge about human nutrition, not specialized knowledge about us. And then, part of what we learn by studying human nutrition in general is that there are differences within a certain range between individuals. And so even the knowledge you have that is specific to you is really not about you as an isolated individual, but you as a subcategory of human beings, as human beings with food allergies, and beneath that, human being with this specific food allergy. And so what I'm trying to stress here is that all your knowledge that's going to guide you as an individual and how to live comes from more abstract knowledge about human beings in general, including certain subcategories of individuals. So the overall point here is that we're always looking to bring the most relevant knowledge to bear in a thinking process. And if you tried to start fresh with you as an individual, you would get nowhere. But if you start from man's life, then it's a relatively easy process, of identifying, okay, here are things where I depart from the normal case. All right, so I wanted to do a little bit of rapid fire. These are questions that I have something to say on, but not enough to go on a whole long rant. There might be an exception towards the end. We'll see. So, what is the objectivist position on animal cruelty? So, similar to abortion, you have to make a distinction between morality and politics. Animal cruelty, if we're talking about either deliberate harm to animals, like things that cause them suffering with no human benefit, or causing them to suffer more than is necessary, Like, that is profoundly immoral. It is, it's hard for me to overstate how disgusting and disturbing that is. But remember, rights are moral principles that help us structure a society where we can deal with people by persuasion rather than force, and you can't deal with animals by persuasion. Some people have pointed out, okay, well, I have this study or this example of an animal that seems to have reason in some form, but the point is that even if they have rudiments of reason, which we could argue about and debate, we can't deal with them by reason. We can't try to persuade them. The only way we can deal with them is through physical means, and therefore trying to actually apply rights is out of the question. But I would say this, because I want to really stress the importance of the morality point. I have no moral issue with ostracizing somebody who's cruel to a dog or a dolphin, to the point where they starve to death. Like that, I would not blink an eye if that happened to a human being who was needlessly and wantonly cruel to an animal. I think it is that disturbing and disgusting. Okay, here's a question. Why couldn't Gail Wynand persuade people towards a favorable opinion of Howard Roark? Was it that since he pandered to people's irrationality, no one listened to him anymore, or did he lack a persuasion technique? It definitely was not that Wynand lacked a persuasion technique. Wynand is somebody who achieved power by pandering to the mob, and he had this rationalization that, like, someday I'm going to use them for my selfish, parentheses, rational ends. And what he finds out is that pandering to the mob didn't make him a master of the mob. It made him a slave of the mob. And so when he tried to switch things, when he tried to actually lead the mob, he found he had no power. And so, in the end, he had no power all along. And, the contrast that we're supposed to get is that Roark is somebody who doesn't want power because he recognizes that if you play that game, you lose. Because the game you should be playing is to do your work your way. And if you do that, then that allows Roark to design his buildings and patiently wait for his kind of people with first-hand standards, to select him as an architect. And he can be patient because he knows that there are other people like him in the world. There are other first-handed people, and he knows that his work is objectively good. He's doing something. He's creating something of genuine value. And so it's not that he'll just be lost and hopeless. Eventually, over the long term, and as people learn to value what he's doing, he will be able to continue doing his work his way. And that's what happens in the novel. Spoiler alert. Let's see. Oh, here's a question. I didn't even prepare any thoughts on this. What do you disagree with in Objectivism? Nothing. But let me clarify that briefly. Objectivism is a system of principles, of philosophic principles, and insofar as I understand them, I agree with them, and that is very different from is there anything that I disagree with Ayn Rand about or other objectivists about, and including how to apply those principles to different things. And it doesn't even say that I understand every last principle of objectivism, though I think I understand the essentials. And so, yeah, there's definitely like more application things or just personal opinions Ayn Rand had where I would disagree. But the level of the system, the essential principles of it, I agree with them. Are objectivists against any kind of groups or just forced groups? I've heard an objectivist say there should be no team sports. I just don't get this view, nor do I think it's in the nature to be only individual competitors. Well, yeah, I agree. The issue is not primarily, though, I think, groups versus forced groups. It's primarily an issue of, are we coming together on the basis of shared, independent, first-handed values, or is the group something we're supposed to conform to and show blind obedience to? And then, yes, if it's like, if that blind obedience is enforced, that just makes it far, far worse. But there's there's obviously tremendous values we get from groups. I mean, just think of a business, right? Like, you couldn't create Apple or Amazon without a group. Ayn Rand joined groups and even created a group. If you think about her role with the Nathaniel Branden Institute that she was involved in. So, no, there's nothing wrong with groups. There's something wrong with collectives. There's something wrong with blind obedience to the groups that ask for individual sacrifice. And it's the same with team sports. Now, the idea isn't that you put the good of the team ahead of your own good, which is how it will often be described. What you're really doing is recognizing that your good is the success of the team, and that the people who sacrifice the team so they can show off aren't being selfish. They're being neurotic and needy. Next question. Let's see. It's basically about the death penalty and what there is to say about that. So Ayn Rand's view, which I totally agree with, is that it's moral that if a person takes a life, if they murder somebody, in justice they deserve to lose their life. But she said in a Q&A that people would argue, and she would be inclined to agree with it, that it's better to let 10 guilty people live, go to jail without parole their whole lives, rather than allow one innocent person to be executed. And I agree with that, and I think it's not just a question I'd be inclined to agree with. I think the evidence is overwhelming that innocent people regularly end up on death row, if not executed, and therefore this is not a power the government should have, not out of sympathy to the criminals, not at all because of that, but because out of our commitment to protecting innocent lives. And you could say, as many defenders of the death penalty do, that what about the innocent lives who are lost when these people get paroled? And that's why I say, you need to have a prison system that actually functions well and that isn't locking up people for things they shouldn't be locked up by, so that you have the resources to actually not parole those people. And part of it is that this is why it's so important to stress, this is not that we should have sympathy or forgiveness towards criminals. I think that genuine criminals, people who violate rights, should be treated probably in most cases far more harshly than today. But in our system, where so many things are illegal and the system is so broken, even there, it's a complicated question of how we treat people who go through our legal system and end up labeled as criminals. But the last thing I'll say on this is just, I'm actually going to have a Liberty Unlocked guest coming up soon who she's head of a conservative organization that's against the death penalty, and so I'm sure we're going to discuss this in a lot more depth. What qualifies anyone as a real philosopher? I had someone say to me, why don't you look up a real philosopher? As I put down to Ayn Rand, trying to dismiss her as a philosopher. Related, when is somebody a philosopher? Are they a philosopher if they contribute or further ideas? Is a teacher of an existing philosophy a philosopher, just a teacher? I think you can use philosopher in two senses. I use it in two senses. And so one is a person who formulates a new philosophy. And another is a person whose profession is discussing or teaching or writing about philosophy. And sometimes those overlap, sometimes they don't. But dismissing Ayn Rand as a philosopher is really an argument from intimidation. It's not they don't think she's a philosopher, it's that they don't like her philosophy. Now, to give the benefit of the doubt to people who raise this objection, there is a sense in which if you are embedded in modern philosophy or contemporary philosophy of the last 100 years or so, you would not recognize what Ayn Rand is doing as philosophy. And that's because she's rejecting the whole approach of modern philosophy. So basically they're looking at her and saying what you're doing is not philosophy, and that's not surprising because she's looking at them and saying what you're doing is not philosophy. You're not providing people with an actual framework for how to live their lives. You're not giving them a system of ideas that integrates their knowledge and allows them to function in the world. And this is not unusual in the history of philosophy. This is a point that either Greg Salmieri or Onkar Ghate have made that I found really helpful, which is if you think about the relationship between Descartes and essentially the kind of religious philosophy that was going on at the time, he was outside of the mainstream school and saying, look, I'm not going to function in your same sort of way because I think your whole approach is wrong. And so it's not uncommon when somebody's saying that the mainstream school is wrong that they won't even be considered a philosopher. And so that's sort of the best interpretation of what's going on with Ayn Rand. Okay, next question. Rand paints the world and man as they should be. What conclusion should we draw about her hero's withdrawal from society? Was she making a normative statement, or was a Gulch immigration policy, or what does a Gulch immigration policy look like? Seems like the most exclusive human society ever. Ayn Rand was adamant. Gulch was not a society. I think she called it a private club. It's something where this is private property and you're inviting your friends together, and it's a big group of friends and they're living there full time. But this is not a society. It's not meant to be a template for society. It's really what it's trying to do. It's highlighting certain things that are relevant to thinking about an ideal society, but it's more focused on making the point of this is how rationally selfish people should and can live together. And the wider point is that fiction's not an instruction manual, and so you can't say okay, this we can just take this and make it a template for real life. When she's talking about the withdrawal from society, she's making a philosophic point, which is that you need to withdraw your sanction from your destroyers. But as she explained, and this is in Robert Mayhew's edited collection of her questions and answers, she was not advocating that we withdraw from society today. What she did say is that we should go on strike from culture, which is you live in the world and you pursue values in the world, but you do not sanction the culture, the bad ideas and bad values that are surrounding you. That's what's required, and that's really the message of the book, not that we should emulate the tactics, which are all fictionalized. Is a corollary of an axiom itself an axiom, even though it is not an independent axiom? All right, so a technical point, but some things to say on this. So in Objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand, Leonard Peikoff talks about causality as a corollary, not an axiom. And he explains his reasoning there. It's because you need the implicit concepts, identity, and action in order to grasp causality. Even though it is self-evident once you have those. You grasp causality perceptually, it is self-evident, but you first have to have implicitly isolated entities that have a specific identity and actions. You need that as a context in order to see causality in the world, but you do see it. And so he's stressing, he says, look, corollaries aren't axioms because they're not self-evident without that earlier context. With that earlier context, then they're self-evident. Now, one thing worth noting is that in Galt's speech, Ayn Rand she talks about identity and consciousness as corollary axioms of existence. But they are axioms. And so here I take corollary to be used in a different sense, because it's not that you need to grasp existence and then that gives you the context to grasp identity or consciousness. Rather, let's take identity. I think, she's saying they're the same facts that are viewed from two different perspectives. So, she has the statement, existence is identity. So I think this is a different sense than the kind of formal idea of a corollary that Leonard Peikoff is outlining in OPAR. But the main thing I'd say here is that we just need to be clear in how we validate. It's valuable to know exactly why objectivists are calling things corollaries and axioms, or to go back to an earlier video, basic axioms. But the real thing that's, I think, the most cash value to you as an individual is how do you validate different items of knowledge? And both axioms and corollaries, as Leonard uses the term, are self-evident. But to understand how corollaries are self-evident, you just need to know that there's antecedent knowledge you need in order to be able to have perceptual awareness of the fact of causality. And the same thing goes true for other corollaries, that they have the same means of validation, which is you just see them, but you can only see them once you have a certain context established. The mistake that Leonard's really pushing against in explaining causality as a corollary of axioms is he's pushing against the idea that they are deduced from identity and action, that they're deduced from axioms. They're not deduced. They don't require proof. Causality doesn't require proof. And to go to a different example he gives of a corollary, free will, it doesn't require proof. These things are self-evident, but they're not primaries. You need to grasp certain primaries in order to have your mind able to become aware of the self-evident fact of causality and free will. Okay, last one, and we'll see if this is a short one or how big a rant this turns into. Objectivism as such says that sex is good if consensual and done in response to values. But what guidelines are there beyond that? Am I right in thinking that sex is good if I can find a woman who embodies great values, even if she isn't completely rational, i.e. perfect, as long as she doesn't embody any great disvalues, e.g. she isn't a Nazi or a communist or a drug addict or a bank robber or a habitual liar? That's quite from perfect to Nazi, communist, and crackhead. But that the greater my commitment to a woman, the more perfect she should have to be, e.g. my standards don't have to be as high for sex as for marriage. And I think this is a really unhealthy way to think about romance, which, you could call it the checklist approach. And it's like you go on a date and you got 10 things that add up to perfection. And once you get to number 6, you're like, all right, cool, we can fool around now. And then you get to number 7, you check that box. And it's like, all right, now we can have sex. And then it's, she missed number 8, so I guess marriage is out of the question. And you need to check all 10 and have perfection, and then you're allowed to marry somebody. And this is just not at all, I think, the right way to think about romance. And a core part of it, we just talked about causality, and one of the, I remember in, I think it was his Confusion Papers course, which isn't publicly available, but Leonard was giving feedback, I believe, to Ankar Gate, and I don't know if I'm not supposed to talk about this since the OAC treats this as a special class, but in any case, there's somebody writing about causality, and they make a point that it is the smoothness of the ball that causes the rolling. And Leonard is adamant, that is not how to understand causality. It is not a characteristic of the ball. It is the ball, the whole entity, that is the cause of the effect. And I have a similar reaction to hearing this. You don't fall in love with these piles of qualities or piles of values that, are kind of constitute a person or something. That is not it at all. It is that there's a whole person, everything about them that you fall in love with, or that you have let me put it different. You have an emotional response to the person, to the whole person. And you can break that down and understand, why am I connecting with them or why am I not connecting with them? But it's you are falling in love, let's say, with a person as a whole being. And you can and you should ask yourself, well, like, what are the values that are relevant here? What am I responding to? Are they really values? Am I responding to something out of context? Am I ignoring some major red flags here? But you're not doing it as like but it's not about checking a list. It's about making sure that your response to somebody and the fiery passion that you feel for them is rooted in reality, and that it's not going to be undercut by something that's going to bring you misery. But there's something that's really sort of like trying to live up to some external standard that you think is imposed by philosophy to say, oh, I need to fall in love with somebody. I'm not allowed to marry somebody unless they're perfect. It's just so foreign from like how I actually think about and experience romance. And I mean, I totally don't agree with this idea that like, oh, I can't marry somebody who's not perfect. Hell, I am not perfect. I think perfect is a very dangerous word. You can use it in morality, and Objectivism does use it in morality. But the way I think about it, and I'm happy to be corrected if somebody thinks that, no, like Watkins, you're off the rails here, is I think about it as perfection means, and the way that one should view oneself is I'm always trying to get better. That there's never, well, we just settle for flaws or failures or shortcomings because no human being can actually execute on morality. No, morality is that which can be executed on because it means just being rational. But the way that you should think about your life, or at least the way that I think about my life, is that I'm on a quest for eternal improvement. And some of those are moral improvements. Some of them are other kinds of improvements. Part of it is being on the lookout for shortcomings in my character or my life that I'm not aware of. And when I'm looking at somebody else, what I'm much more interested in than is she perfect or is she not perfect or is he perfect or is he not? What I think I'm interested in, what I think we should be interested in, is what is their attitude towards any flaws or shortcomings? Do they just make excuses for them? Do they acknowledge them? Do they settle for them? Or are they on that same quest that you should be on to continually get better and continually achieve more in your life? Now, if you're thinking about marriage, there is a real question of there's certain value clashes, many of which might not even be moral, that you think this is a deal killer. I remember amusingly, somebody asked Leonard on his podcast about like, I'm with a woman who won't perform oral sex, and like, can I get married? Is that a deal breaker? And Leonard's answer was, you have to really ask, like, am I willing to go decades and decades without something that is, profoundly pleasurable to me? So like, my point is not that, like, you should just settle for like whatever happens to fall in your lap, as it were. And my point is not that there aren't certain moral failings that should completely discount somebody. But the primary is this somebody that I just want to be around all the time and share my life with? Like, it's that gut level feeling of like, am I into this person? And you're reflecting on those shared values, not in order to like prove yourself to morality or sit back and go, miss, are you perfect enough for me? Which most of the people ask this. I'm not saying this question in particular, but most of the people who say this, they have a long way to go before they come close to being perfect in any respect. Like where was I going with that? Yeah, like, the reason you're asking those questions is just as a check, because it's easy to jump into a romance that you really on some level know is bad and self-destructive for you, but you're doing it because you're lonely. You're doing it for like you're attracted to certain things for like bad reasons or kind of psychological reasons that you wouldn't endorse if it was fully conscious. So you want to check on that. A lot of it, though, is just to really deepen and enjoy those values. But the main thing I want to highlight here is when Ayn Rand says what we fall in love with is our values embodied in another person, the embodied is really important. It's not that we fall in love with abstractions and like we're just looking for those abstractions kind of like hung or tied on to a human body. It's the person, but it's the person viewed from the perspective of, I admire these things and enjoy these things about them. But what I'm trying to get at, and I'm sorry if I'm not articulating it perfectly, is that like you need to view people as people, not as like these playthings that are supposed to represent philosophy and allow you to role play being a hero and a hero worshiper and all of that. Like that is, I see this a lot in young people. I had a little bit of it myself when I was quite young. And it's really self-destructive, and it will prevent you from finding happiness. Like I have seen guys and girls, but it's usually guys who make this mistake, in my experience, throw away real relationships that they could have had and that could have brought them a lot of joy because they felt like, oh, my philosophy tells me that that's wrong. And that's wrong. Like if you love spending time with somebody and there's some flaws in his or her character, but you acknowledge that and you accept it and you're aware of it and you like their attitude towards dealing with it. Like if you want to spend your life together, if you're not talking about things that are going to be really destructive, then do it. Like don't throw away that joy. And like that's really the main lesson I want, is like be really selfish and not view the world as this thing that you are viewing with suspicion and denying yourself pleasure because it doesn't check off something on your philosophic list. So at this point, I think I'm repeating myself. Hope that was helpful. Really want you to be happy and get joy out of these things. And so go out there and do it. Would love to get people's feedback, particularly in that last question. This is something where I've not spoken a lot about publicly because it's not, I think these areas are complex, and I really want to get my thinking at a higher level and my ability to communicate on them at a higher level. So let me know what you think. Email me at don@donswriting.com. Send in those questions. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like this video. Sign up for the newsletter at donswriting.com. And I look forward to doing another video very soon. Have a happy weekend, everybody. Can't wait to talk to you again.